Hello and welcome to our third webinar of the SAP Around the Globe webinar series. My name is Milena Leibold and I'm responsible for organizing these webinars in the context of my social media activities that I do for the Strategy as Practice interest group. This is the third one, as said, of the webinar series. The webinar series aims at introducing different perspectives around the world, introducing into strategy as practice research from different perspectives. And 3 weeks ago, we welcomed Manuel Henao Restrepo and Luz Marivas from Colombia, who shared very rich insights into participatory research methods, from data collection to analysis to also visualization. And today we find ourselves in another context, namely in India, and I'm very, very happy to introduce you to Biswatosh, who is our speaker of today. Biswatosh Saha, he is a strategy professor and is with a strategy group at the Indian Institute of Management in Calcutta. And he is professor of strategic management since 2017 there. His research focuses on three separate but interdependent tropes, namely strategy as practice, decolonization, and an Indic conceptualization of strategy. And Biswatosh will tell us more about the Indian research context today, and I'm super happy that he's here with us. I'll stop my screen now and give the word over to Biswatosh.
Now, let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the scholarly community of Strategy as Practice and the masters who began this group, their hard work of love and labor, which has created this space. The concepts of Strategy as Practice has helped us in India, very strangely enough, to understand our own context much better, although we are situated in this place. But without those conceptual tropes available to us, our own understanding of our own context was challenged. And as we go through the conversation that I hope to have with you, possibly that will become clearer. So, my thanks to the scholarly community of SAP for enabling that. Now, the title of this thing is Context Insights from India. The word context in English has a strange connotation. It's actually a very empty word. When you say context, you can mean almost anything. There's nothing inside it. You have to fill it up. But the word context really signifies, as a placeholder, a certain emptying, right? Emptying of more general understandings, a conceptual, epistemic focus on what is immediately around that local, what we call the local context, around the actor, and so on and so forth. So it invites an attention to a departure from more generalized understandings. So the use of this word context in this talk would signify, well, if we zoom in into India, there may be something strange. And so my attempt in this little conversation that I plan to have with you would be to help maybe populate the word context a little better, the context of India, so that as we move forward, the ontology of what the context of India is and what is its specificities, if there are any, becomes a little clearer. So that is the takeaway that I hope to provide as we go along in this course, in this little talk. So I have chosen not to have a slide deck, right? And that is on purpose. I don't use slide decks even in my classes that I have in my business school. In the Indian tradition, you see, if you think of any meditative practices around the world, if you have to have deeper understanding of anything, the first thing you are told is to shut off the visual cue, close your eyes, right? Which means shutting off the visual cue. So I don't want to use a visual cue, and so no slide deck. Let us focus on the talk and the words that are flowing out. And maybe in your mind, you try to construct that image of the context of India, because it's empty right now. I invite you to empty it out and try to paint the context of India and its dynamics as we narrate. Now you are free to stop me at any point in time, because this is a very small group and we can structure it as more informal conversations. Whenever you think that, well, something is not making sense, there are clarifications that you want to seek, and please feel free to interject and I'll take it up. So the title has the two words, context and India. Now, India is the name of a place, right? A territorial entity that you know of, right? And a nation state, a political unit, right? So in a Wittgensteinian sense, it's a name, it's a label for a territory and a political state. But what we don't know as interpretive researchers, is it contested? And the answer, strangely, is it is. If you have experience of living in India, you will know that India is not the name by which people living within this territory ever used to call this country, nation, state, and all that. So this is a name given to this territory by people who looked at it from outside, either for purposes of trade, various forms of engagement, or for conquest. Within all other local languages, which are the vernacular languages in India, and there are a lot, many of them, India is referred to as Bharat. There is no word called India. The name of this territorial country is Bharat. So what does a name matter? And as a researcher, as an early researcher who joined academics in early 90s, I was sensitive to all of these, because you see, I was familiar with the vernacular language. I know that the country is called Bharat in Sanskrit, in Hindi, in Bengali, which is my mother tongue, and all the other Indian languages. But it's called India in English. So my take on it was initially, well, it's just a matter of a language, right? So it's a matter of translation. So I did not attach any greater importance to this name difference. If you are a Wittgensteinian, you will know that names are never neutral. Names are labels to deeper practices. And I was alerted to this when I got introduced to the work of an Indian legal scholar, a very young, rising, ambitious Supreme Court lawyer in India, J. Sai Deepak, who had a book. I was introduced to him before he got the book in. The title of the book was India, that is Bharat. And in that, he explores the notion that he points out that, well, if you go to the founding document of this country, the legal text, which is the Constitution, the Constitution begins with this statement, India, that is Bharat. So there is this dichotomy between this wordplay of India and Bharat, the use of English language and the regional, the vernaculars, in the founding document of the country. And it might be a very simple move, right? But as I went through that book, I slowly realized that that was a marker of a very, very deep debate, conflict, tussle between two groups who subscribe to extremely different practices. So the group which wanted the naming of India, because that was a time when India had the opportunity of calling itself by a different name and being recognized in the world by a different name. Practically, at that point, when we are on obtaining political autonomy to take independent, autonomous political decision, that possibility was open. So what will be the name of the country was a big debate in a body called the Constituent Assembly, which was the body tasked to frame the constitution according to which independent India will be governed in terms of its legal system. So the group which wanted the name India, and Sai Deepak's work has gone into the details of all those debates. They are all archived in what is called the Constituent Assembly archives, and it's openly accessible for anybody who wants to go and do the research on it. So the group which wanted the nomenclature India were all people who had gone abroad, trained themselves mostly in UK universities, and had come back. And for them, the image that they wanted to build the country on was the image of Europe. They wanted India to become like the developed European country. So their articulation was India should be built in the image of Europe. The second group, which wanted the nomenclature of Bharat, were people more interested in, more integrated into more traditional pre-modern practices in India, which were civilizational in nature and went very long back into its very old civilizational history. So between these two groups, there was lots of debates and lots of differences. And if I use a Shatskian way of looking at a practice, then the two groups had different opinion, absolutely different perspective of morality and of perspective of what Shatsky would call the telos, the teleoaffective structure of a practice, of how they looked into past Indian practices. What the India group was called modernists, and the modernists wanted a clear break from tradition, and they looked down upon the older practices of India in every sphere, in the economic sphere, in the sphere of forms of organizing, in the spheres of politics, in spheres of theology, religion, and so on. Whereas the other group were more deeply civilizationally rooted. They wanted continuity. They wanted to build the new India based on a deeper continuity with its past, and had much greater respect for rebuilding India in the image of its past, of course, suited to the modern times. And this was a great fundamental conflict at the founding moment of this territory that you call the context of India. And this debate and conflict has not gone away. So strangely, what has happened is this naming that India, that is Bharat, was the only concession. This insertion of the word Bharat was almost the only political concession which the group, which was more civilizationally oriented, could obtain in the Constituent Assembly, although they were in majority. Soon after, all of the other constitutional pillars, the structure of law and legal system in India, got modeled on the India model, which was inspired by the European practices of enlightenment. So there was a certain kind of silencing of the group which was more civilizationally oriented. And their claims and their debates and their positions in the Constituent Assembly debate soon went away from public memory and from discursive memory in almost every sphere of life, including law, parliamentary debates, political debates, sociological debates. They remained as texts archived in the Constituent Assembly archives and did not circulate at all. So when I entered the profession as a scholar, my image of the country and the India-Bharat dichotomy was just a simple linguistic play. I had no idea of the deeper debates that had preceded or that had happened at the moment of constitution of the country. right? So what all of these means is, but what is the implication of that silencing of this civilizational group? The two groups, therefore, they had two contrasting images of what they wanted to build. One wanted a clear rupture from the past. Another wanted to build the future in a series, as a continuity of the past. One was respectful about the past. One had disdain about the past. So the modernist almost existed in what you would call the Buddhosian relational opposition to the constitutional, the civilizational group. And it became a deep political contest. Now, although the position of the civilizational group almost became silent in formal debates and official talks and the printed word, their practices survived in what you call the informal settings. The major difference that you see in the Indian context between formality and informality is that the informal practices are more rooted in deeper civilizational understandings and are more traditional in nature. So although all of these did not find a formal expression, either in formal law or in formal policy debates, and in the educational system that young people were exposed to, it survived in private spaces, smaller community spaces, and so on and so forth. So if you look at it as a kind of practice, it basically shrunk in its spatial spread. So one way to understand the Indian context and one of its characteristics is that in this country, you will find practices which are of different ages. So even in a highly modern India, you will find practices which are millennially civilizationally millennial, very, 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 very old and coming out from almost unknown antiquities. In its almost extremely pristine form, where some smaller groups, very small groups, often within very small lineages and families, would preserve that practice. So once you zoom into the details, the micro details of activities into India, the doings in the Indian context, you often find these dichotomies, the existence of multiple ages at the moment that you are studying. So the modern India is not modern India, it's modern India, it's ancient India, it's India of antiquity, it's people who call themselves Bharat, it's people who are very civilizationally oriented. It's also people who want to create India in the image of Europe, extremely modern, with a clear rupture from its own past. So it's a melange, or it's a tapestry of all of these different things which coexist. So conceptually, therefore, if you want to study this context, you have found it very useful to understand that, you see, an antiquity is something which is an old practice, is not only existing in a scalar time scale of antiquity, right? 20 years old, 200 years old, 2000 years old, 20,000 years old. This is a scalar view of time. But each of those 20 years or 200 years or 2000 years back is also a reflection of a very different sensibility, a very different quality of time. And in Indian cosmology, we refer to such times as yugas. They are different ages because they are not only different scalar times, it's a reflection of a different sensibility, a different telos on a practice, a different understanding of a practice, a different morality around a practice. Right. And therefore, in Indian cosmology, it is said that time is not linear at all. So time does not progress. Time moves in cycles. So what you see as a practice which is very powerful today, very dominant today, its dominance comes from its spatial spread. It's rich. The spatial scale of its shared meaning within the existing society. And a practice which is a weaker practice, or which possibly is a defeated practice, like the civilizational people who lost out in the Constituent Assembly debates, and therefore much of their ideas and sensibilities could not get institutionalized in the formal constitutional law, still continued those practices in smaller, more unorganized spheres of community life, family life, lineages, and so on and so forth. So the practices, defeated practices, don't go away. Defeat is not annihilation in India. Defeat means withdrawal of the spatial scale within which the practice subsists or continues in its existence. So one way to characterize the Indian context is it's a melange of multiple practices which can be traced to very different ages in a very complex dynamic of spatial expansion and recession, right? And in many cases, when we have dived deep into a certain phenomena through mainly tools of ethnography, we have found this play to be very active in almost all important strategic contexts which are significant for organizational survival, growth, and so forth. Main important strategic decisions. And I will illustrate that through 2 or 3 examples. So if you look into the ontology of the context in this way, then SAP research, which tries to connect the micro doings of managers and various kinds of strategies actors to the macro context of the shared social meanings, you face a major challenge. The challenge is like this. While we zoom into the context and the details and nitty-gritties of the doings, the significance of those doings are revealed only when we are able to zoom out and take a broader view. But because your context now allows for the coexistence of different practices who exist in different time-space scales, what you have to zoom out to is not very clear. So for instance, if I have to just illustrate, for me, I was looking at India-Bharat debate as a naive observer who had not researched on it, only as a linguistic play of translation, of maybe an assertion of linguistic nationalism at most at that level. So I could zoom out only to the level of the language. But the work of Sai Deepak, who could go into the archives of the Constituent Assembly debates and bring out texts that are generally silenced, the texts that are not in circulation, and from those texts reconstruct the meaning of that debate, got a deeper understanding of what that Bharat-India play meant. So for instance, if you read the constitutions today, you still have the Bharat-India play. So you deep dive into that artifact, the Indian constitution, you will get that play. But your ability to interpret it depends on, in your zooming out exercise, which time-space scale of the social phenomena you zoom out to. And interpretation of the strategy work in India faces this major challenge, which is methodological. So I'm making 2 claims here. One is that in India, multiple ages, or what in India we call jugas, which basically is both scalar time difference and difference in the quality of time, which is a nuanced understanding, the shared understanding behind the practice, the teleology, the morality behind the practice. They are varying, and all of them coexist in the same phenomena at the modern moment. And this unpacking or unbundling that you have to do is dependent on a correct zooming out into the relevant time scale space through which you can understand what is the macro dynamics which shapes this micro conflict. So as an observer, therefore, as a researcher, your vantage point becomes very important. And a major source of misreading of India comes precisely from the fact that people who are reading the macro context from a distance, they can access material and artifacts which only have a larger circulation. Say, for instance, the constitutionalists the civilizational people in the Constituent Assembly who lost out, their practices surviving in an informal context in the way community decisions are made in a business community, for instance, how trade credits are given and how credit disputes are resolved. Some of the sensibilities that are played out in those interactions, they do not leave a trace of text anywhere. And therefore, because they don't leave a trace on texts which are formal, those sensibilities don't circulate widely. So how you see India depends on which texts you look at, what data you look at, and all data is a certain form of text. There are certain texts which have large spatial reach, and if you're observing India from very far off, it's probably very high probable even that you are experiencing those texts which have a certain intensity of circulation, a certain spatial reach of circulation. And that is the story of the current victors within the social space, within this context, because it is a reflection of the practice which is more popular, so to say, right? It has reached a certain spatial scale. Therefore, the voice of what you call the practices which are subaltern or relatively silenced within these local contexts are difficult to read and interpret from a distance. It requires a lot of zooming into the context and zooming out into the time scales that are relevant, right, for understanding the dynamics in that local context. So let me go out and give one example from my own experience. I'll give two examples to illustrate this. Say, when I began my scholarly life, early 1990s, strategy was a discipline which was just picking up in India. And strategy globally was established then by mid-80s as a very significant and powerful discipline in the major US business schools, European business schools. But in India, it is only in 1990s that strategy departments in different schools were slowly being set up. Now, as India-based research started happening in strategy, people started looking out into the West for cues of how to characterize India. And the characterization which became most popular and on which almost all the India-based strategy research was focused on was the characterization of India as emerging market, which many of you would also be familiar with. Now, if you look into this characterization and do a deeper analysis of it from a practice perspective, who characterized it, look into the texts that were the primary characterizers, which groups characterized it and what were their interests, what was their purpose, what were the micro events which first made this characterization. You will trace this emerging market characterization to the new work of international lenders who wanted to lend to a category of newly emerging economies, which were, in terms of its macroeconomics, more stable than less developed economies. So it was a credit evaluation requirement which first created this characterization of emerging economies as a certain category, which was stable, high growth, and therefore investment grade from the perspective of financial institutions, mostly in the United States. Now, it is this characterization. So, how did they look at India? It was again, like I said, India was the name of this territory given by somebody who wanted to trade with India or wanted to conquer India. So, it was an outsider's view of name given to this territory. So, the emerging market characterization did not grow out of organic understanding of Indian scholars in India. It was Western scholars' characterization of this country, driven by the Western interest of lending into this territory, which was a very useful, important step. Right? That India becoming an investment grade for many US financial institutions opened up financial flows to the Indian space. But the purpose was somebody else's trade requirement, and that led to the characterization. And if you go into the details of the emerging market characterization, you will realize that it characterizes India as, or all emerging markets as markets which are emerging and converging towards the Western template of market economies. And the characterization of the country was by what it lacked. Say, for instance, it lacked good financial markets, lacked good venture capital institutions, it lacked many other things, and which became the policy focus of almost all advocacy work. Build up these institutions so that you become trade worthy in terms of those financial exchanges. Now, there is nothing wrong with this. But I want all of us to understand that it was the interest of the people who wanted financial relationships with India which led to this characterization. And what this characterization missed, for instance, was what is it that Indian systems have which maybe other systems outside don't have. For instance, significant role of the family and community in business. So this was never flagged off as an essential feature of this territory. So the feature that we lacked a venture capital institution formally, that we lacked high tradable secondary stock markets where the secondary stocks trade will be a very significant part of GDP, were the characteristics on which ratings were done. But ratings were not on, characterization were not on what we really were. Right? So once I understood this through my own work, that where is emerging market characterization coming from? And this is the sensibility which SAP brings in. SAP scholarship never looks at the content of strategy, right? Never looks into what is the decision, really looks into the work which goes behind the decision. Who were the actors? What were those forums? Where were the meeting held? What were the interest and what was the debate? What was the clash of interest and its dynamics? And so on and so forth. And tries to understand the nature of the strategy work from all of that. So this exercise with the help of the SAP tools helped me understand the nature of the emerging market characterization, and therefore helped me understand that, well, that characterization is good from the perspective of a certain context, from the requirement of certain actors, and therefore in my scholarship I can also empty it out. Right? It does not capture my own context. So the interesting part of the word context is just this, that it's an emptying device. it points out to the possibility that, well, the generalizable truth is not generalizable here in your place. And that is the power of the English word context. And uh, the, the SAP scholarship really helped me contextualize this emerging market characterization as a phenomena which is driven by the interest of some outside actor, which is fine, but which will not help me capture the details of the context that I find in my ethnographic inquiries. And rightly, as I went around with many of my students into details of ethnographic work, we found a very strange thing, that although our stock markets and the secondary financial institutions were weak, all along, when even at a phase when India was under extreme government regulatory licenses, almost modeled on the Russian communist system and the socialist planning system, in the hinterland of the country, about which you don't hear in the press, the life of the hinterland commerce never reaches, that has that spatial reach, and the news doesn't go out and spread out into the whole world. In that, those crevices of social and business and economic life, markets were always very, 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 very active in India. And this informal space, what we call the informal markets in India, were almost never ever regulated. So the phenomena that India was a regulated economy also applied only to the large investments. And the regulated enterprises always dealt with a large category of small business enterprises, often which were of extremely micro sizes, family based, driven and governed by communities, where credit flowed according to community norms. And the large firms were regulated, had to deal with this market force all along. Now, this rendering of business life in India never found its way, because we always, in fact, sitting inside our business schools in this country, always use the emerging market lens to look into our own context. And therefore, we got blinded to this, the contextual details of a living communitarian markets that are all there to be seen in India, right? Now, if you look into the scale of capital deployed, the scale of capital deployed in this informal setup was much larger than the scale of capital deployed in the formal system. So this is not just small space, this is large space. And this is an essential feature that I have realized over my years of research experience, that just like if you go back what I told you, the civilizational groups which lost out in the Constituent Assembly were not in minority. They were the majority group in that Constituent Assembly who failed to put their mark on the proceedings and the nature of proceedings of the Constituent Assembly. So similarly, it is this vast swath of commercial ethnic business in India, which doesn't find an expression on in the global stage of what India business looks like, right? And there's a reason for that, because texts, data, narrations, narratives, experiences, to make sense of them is not there in texts which circulate globally. So to discover them, you have to really zoom in very deep ethnographic dives, spend time in this community, and then slowly discover this space. But what is interesting is this is a very, very, very large space in India. And in fact, one of the key features, if you have to understand the Indian economy, why did India handle COVID much better than rest of the world? What is the shock absorber in the Indian economy? It is in this space. It is not in the formal sector. It is in this very large informal sector, right? So almost all of my work with PhD students has revealed strange features of this informal market, which are not acknowledged in the formal literature, either on Indian business or on Indian strategy practices. right? So let me go now a little deeper into one example of one student's work in a slightly different space, which was development, right? Now, see, in India, India is a country with very little land. It's a very densely populated country, and therefore land use conflicts are very strong in India. So there are too many people per acre or per square meter of land. It's very densely populated. So there is a hot contest for land use. And if you look around the Indian territory, you will find also large swaths of land which are characterized as wasteland, which is in terms of its agricultural productivity quite useless. So there is a big program of Indian government called wasteland development. Now, one of my students got into see, like ethnography is dependent on whom you know and all the happenstances and serendipities of where do you get access, because these deep dives, especially in an Indian context where there is so much silencing and so on and so forth, is not easy. So we got a serendipitous connection with somebody who had played a stellar role in wasteland development and had developed a wasteland into a fairly prosperous, agriculturally evolved, economically successful area. So it was a development entrepreneur, say you can call a social entrepreneur, who played that role. And we went into understanding what was their work and what was the nature of what they were doing and how they were doing it and so on and so forth. Now, what was interesting was in that, as we got into the data and unraveled that story, we realized that that area, which had grown absolutely barren, was chosen by the government for wasteland development. Now, the model of wasteland development was inspired by a development grant and aid that the Indian government had got from international aid agencies. And the structure of that program about how to roll it out, what will be planted, what is the process of developing it, all of that had come from the think tanks of the international development financial institutions to the central government in India. And it was that plan which was being rolled out. So a critical element of that was choice of species to be planted in the social forestry projects. And that was motivated by the desire to create enough space or enough raw material for the paper industry. And this we figured out only much later, that why were certain species being chosen as the favored species to be implemented in the wasteland development plan. But for the social entrepreneur whom we are tracing, the interesting point of departure was he realized that given the choice that the species choice that the program policy uh, formulated, the program was not taking off on the ground and local people were not interested in it. So that set him thinking, and he started engaging with the local context and understanding the requirements of the local people, so for their local practices and so on and so forth. It was then that two things came out. One was in that local area, there was a folk tradition preserved in folk music and folk tales and folk songs, which painted that area as a green, lush green, extremely friendly environment, wet and moist, with a spring, a lively spring being there. Now, the current terrain of that area was, when the social environment went there, absolutely barren, dry, drought prone, extremely poverty stricken. with a lot of turmoil in people's economic and social life. But there was this folk tradition of that being a very prosperous place. So the interesting thing about the social entrepreneurs thing was he came from a family who had lot of they were a family who had lot of less respect for their own lineage. So he had a deep respect for traditions, and he in some sense believed in this folk wisdom that this place once was extremely green. There was no records of that, neither in government records, so there was no evidence on printed paper, any textual evidence about that. The memory that this was a place which was very fertile was only in informal folk wisdom. And he banked on that. And he started believing that that is recoverable. If that was the nature of the terrain once at one point in time, it can be recovered. And then he started working. So the important thing to understand is he could actually cross those time scale thing that I was talking about. He could go back to folk tradition and take an inspiration from there that, well, this would be a practice. If it leaves a trace in the folk tradition and the folk songs, it is a reflection of a different time scale, right? And from that faith, his work began. And then he started working, and then he started innovating on the species choices. The first thing he did was inspire, understand the local interest, and move away from the official understanding of what are the species to be planted, violated the norms. In all programs and all legal systems, you have that gray zone. So she used that gray zone maximally to start planting things which are not supposed to be planted, but which had interest from the farmers, which evinced interest from the farmers, which gave them quicker returns, particularly fruits, vegetables, which improved their nutrition, and a particular form of grass, tapioca grass, which helped them in a certain form of toy making, which was an important source of their livelihood at that point in time. So the result of this was, you see, immediately people started taking interest in the social forestry program. And once this social forestry started taking interest, they became ambassadors, and they took the saplings that were available for free from the government nurseries. And suddenly, within a space of 2-3 years, I think around 5 years, he could reach a massive spatial expansion of these practices. So practices of wasteland development suddenly prospered and blossomed in that area. It was the practices spatially scaling up very fast because it was in the interest of the people who were uh, participants in it. A very bottom-up kind of participative approach. Now, once this scaling happened and the green cover changed in that region, the surprising thing was that spring did actually revive back. Right. And so you see the interesting part, the strategic play of the entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, if you look at it, was the ability to cross those time scale spatial barriers. He could go back to the past to interpret the present and then create a certain scaling of the practice of wasteland development by making the local people interested in it. So in the Indian context, it is in many cases, success or failure of strategic moves depends on this interpretation of the practice and connecting the practices to the lives of people so that you have a scaling of the spatial scaling of the practice, right? So if I now go back to the mainstream strategy literature, not strategy as practice, but the mainstream strategy literature on competitive advantage and so on and so forth, where the search for a strategist or what a strategist desires is superior profitability, right? Competitive advantage. In India, the game of strategy is not about competitive advantage almost at all. It is because if you look again into extremely competitive markets where if you look into profitability of firms, they are all almost bunched together. You do not have those outlier financial performers. So the game of strategy in India is managing these spatial spread of practices and stabilizing it. So your new innovative practices become strategically successful. It will not give you great financial returns in terms of profitability, but it will give you growth and stabilization. It will give you a certain resilience. So what most Indian entrepreneurs are seeking is actually resilience of practices. And the challenge to the resilience of practices comes from the fact that they are operating under a context or within a context where so many timescales are coexisting. So all of it are in very strange notions with each other, sometimes in conflicts with each other, bitter conflicts with each other. Like, for instance, you see the bitter conflict that I started off with in the Constituent Assembly, which leads to the absolute silencing of the majority group. Sometimes in friendly coexistence, sometimes in forms of strange hybridization. Right? So you can have many forms of relationships between these multiple practices who owe their origin or their rationality of telos, the teleological affective rationality of their existence, to different timescales. The past survives and sometimes creates bitter conflicts for the present. Sometimes they work in tandem with the present. Sometimes the modern practices, like for many distribution companies, this is a major problem in India, that in distribution, because you are dependent on the very large fragmented supply chain, right? I told you about the vast informal space and the capital that the ethnic businesses command. So if you are a big company, say a steel company or a cosmetics company wanting to sell soaps, detergents, and so on and so forth, your last mile delivery, which finally reaches the consumer, is mediated through so many layers of this informal business, all of whose world of practice is very different from the world of corporate practices. Their religion, family, and business are all intertwined with each other. Credit moves to circles of family evaluation and religious spaces. So the norms and practices in that space is very different from what you call the formal practices of a corporate organization, which works on separation of personal and organizational life, right? It's more formal in that sense. Separation of your religious life from the formal organizational life. All those separations fall out and collapse in this informal space on which your formal organizations also depend. So for many of those organizations, the main challenge is, how do I stabilize my supply line? In terms of the practices, how do I ensure that this long line of informal chain which I am dependent on are following practices which are sort of synergistic with my practices that I am attempting to do? How do I reach my goals, my objectives of a certain way of reaching the consumer? So failure or success in India, primarily in a strategic sense, and that's a challenge, comes from your ability or inability to manage these tensions from multiple practices. And these tensions that I am pointing to is not tensions in a limited space. It's geo-historically, civilizationally constructed. So it's the longitude playing out, right? And it will play out, right? It is, and what you see in India in the last 10 years, a nationalistic resurgence. From outside, it looks like a nationalistic resurgence, often characterized by many Western observers as a right turn, a rightist nationalist resurgence. But if you live within India, within these spaces, it's a resurgence of the civilizational group which got defeated in the Constituent Assembly debate. So the challenge in India is of doing strategy as practice work is to go zoom into the details, because that access itself, because of the secrecies and the silencing and all of that, that many of them prefer not to deal with formal actors, because they fear if some of those practices get formalized, there will be legal action, because they survive on margins of legality in a certain sense, because law does not recognize that, right? So in a certain sense, getting access itself, the zooming in itself is a challenging exercise, which depends on circumstances, fate, luck, and whatever you say. And then once you go into the detail, you're zooming out to understand the significance of that. Depends on your right choice of its historicity, because multiple scales are, time scales are operating at the same point in time. Right. So this is my descriptor in a certain sense of the context in India, my little attempt to fill up that emptiness of the context, right? And I hope I have been able to give you certain descriptions which are very strange. This is not the nature, I think, of many other contexts. Now, if you, as a final conclusion, if you say, what is it that gives this people in this Indian context the strength to survive when they are defeated? Because victory does not seem to be the only strategic objective in India, right? For the Constituent Assembly defeated civilizationalists, if I may name them that way, they lost. But in a sense, they won because they have been able to preserve and be in a resilient way, preserve a continuity with their practices through extremely bad times. So that last 10 years, you see their resurgence now. So very silent, patient work and patient practices for decades together under very difficult, oblivious conditions, when what they were doing never reached any spaces, was never specially scaled up. Or the practices of the ethnic trading communities whose norms of lending are always operating on the legal margin. They're never fully legal. And yet they have preserved those norms of lending, and they are able to ensure extremely high success rate on return of loans, which is very low NPAs, very low default rates on those loans. So these are not documented, and they do not want to document it. So in a certain sense, what gives resilience to this system? What is the philosophy? And the little that I have studied all of them, my realization is it's the root of this resilience is in understanding of Indian spirituality. Because Indian notions of Vedic notions, the Vedantic notions of spirituality, looks at moksha as the purpose of life. And the understanding of moksha is freedom from the cycle of birth and death. So it's a non-material objective, final objective of life. Now, if this itself surprises most of you, if you have to just recall a event which happened just about a year or two back, called Kumbh Mela in India, which was a major gathering on the banks of a river where three rivers meet together. It's a sangam of three rivers, a confluence of three rivers. And the story is that if you take a dip there on a certain day when stars are aligned in a certain way, you get moksha. Now, I'm not getting into the question of whether you get moksha or not get moksha. The interesting thing as a social science observer is that about 60% of the Indian population, 60% of the Indian population went within those 2 months to that place across social classes, from the poorest person to the top business tycoons, went to that place to take that dip. So it means in terms of the telos of the practices of your life, the notion of moksha is very important in India. So for a person believing in moksha or having a certain spiritual life, how do they engage with practical life of business, money, profit, power, politics? The answer to that in Indian spiritual practice is you engage with it through a certain sense of detachment, which essentially means you can think of it like this. It's like you engage with it as if you are in a dramatic play. So as long as you're in a play, so for instance, you are in a theatrical play, you are acting out the role of a crooked, tough man. Then as long as you are in the play, you have to play out that tough, crooked man very, very diligently and sincerely, right? With a full realization that this role has spatial and temporal delimitation. So that is my final conclusion in a certain sense, because this whole sense of playing a game is very strong in India. And all games are time space limited. So in a certain intuitive sense, Indians have this sense of all my practices are space time delimited. Right. So if I'm spatially shrinking, and if I have a deep respect for this temporality of antiquity, I can still see my preservation of a little tradition in its pristine form in a small scale as a victory. Right. So the understanding of strategic objectives, given this spiritual rooting, it takes a different form. Right. So I'll conclude here.
Thank you very much.
Welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Biswatosh. This was extremely interesting, super interesting to hear.